Shalom, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Theology in Under 10, a Bible study for busy people. In this episode, I want to talk about the plague of darkness in Exodus. What was this plague of darkness? I want to begin this podcast by reading Exodus 10:21 through 23. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, a darkness to be felt." So Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and there was pitch darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. They did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days. All the people of Israel had light where they lived. Now, this podcast is not about the 3 days of darkness. If you want me to explore that in another podcast, I can do that. But this episode, I want to just talk about what scholars, theologians believe this darkness was. So what was this darkness? The Bible does not give us a specific answer on how the darkness came about or the source, other than it was the Lord's doing as a judgment on Egypt. But there are a lot of interesting theories of what this darkness might have been. And that's what I want to talk about in this episode. So I want to start with the first theory, which is fog. Anyone who's driven through fog knows that it can be dangerous because you can hardly see anything. And that is what some theologians believe is happening here. A fog that's so thick that visibility is zero. And it would also explain why the Egyptians were not able to just create a fire, because the fog would have extinguished any flame that they tried to ignite. The fog theory would also explain why the darkness could be felt. A second theory is a solar eclipse. Some scholars think this was an eclipse. There was an eclipse March 5th, 1223 BC, and this could have possibly coincided with the plague of darkness, especially if the Egyptians had a total eclipse in their area, but the Israelites only had a partial eclipse. That would explain the discrepancy between the total darkness in Egypt and the light in Goshen. Another theory, and I actually got this theory from a rabbi, was that this was primordial darkness. One rabbi thought that this darkness was a supernatural darkness and equivalent to the darkness that was in the world before God created light. So what's also interesting is that some scholars think that the pitch darkness doubled as a spiritual darkness. People weren't just blind to God as Savior, but also blind to each other's needs. The fourth theory is that the darkness in Exodus is volcanic ash. They believe there was an eruption 3,500 years ago on an island near Crete that caused the Exodus plague. Although the island is about 500 miles from Egypt, it's possible the ash made its way into that territory. Another theory is that it was not volcanic ash, but something close, a sandstorm. This would explain why the people not only lost the ability to see, but they couldn't leave their homes or light a fire. Another theory, and I thought this was really interesting, is that the darkness was a physical element that only affected the Egyptians. It was something on their eyes, like cataracts or some illness that made it impossible for them to see. And I also want to mention some naturalistic theories or interpretations of what this darkness was. And one is that it was a spiritual darkness that would be like depression. In some sense, this just gives the Exodus 10 plague a very metaphorical interpretation. But I could understand why some theologians might consider this theory, because depression removes light. It's isolating. It makes it difficult to rise or leave the house. It definitely can be physically felt, and no candle or fire can make it go away. What I think is most important is the meaning of this plague. This plague was a reminder that God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. Without the Lord, people can't see where they're going, and they certainly can't see others properly. Only God can light our pathway, because he is the true source of light. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If this podcast has helped you, subscribe, share with someone you think might be helped by this message. I love you all. Have a great week. Shalom.